For 50 years, Thomas Whitmore believed that money was never the most valuable thing inside a bank. Trust was. People often assumed he had built Community First Bank because he understood finance. They were wrong. He built it because, as a young man, he had watched his father lose everything. Not just his savings, his confidence, his sleep, his belief that anyone in a suit could be trusted again. Thomas never forgot the day his father quietly said, "The money hurts, but it's the feeling that nobody cared that stays with you." Those words stayed with Thomas for the rest of his life. Years later, when he opened his first little bank branch, he wrote one sentence on a yellow legal pad before he wrote a single business plan. People should leave our bank feeling safer than when they entered. Not richer, not faster, safer. That sentence became the foundation of Community First Bank. 50 years later, Thomas no longer ran the company. He had retired almost a decade earlier. Young executives had modernized the bank. Online banking, mobile apps, artificial intelligence to detect fraud. The bank had never been stronger, or so everyone believed. On a rainy Tuesday morning, Thomas decided to visit the very first branch. Not to inspect it, not to surprise anyone. He simply needed to update the signature on one of his accounts after renewing his passport. He took his old leather briefcase, locked the front door of the small house he had shared with Helen for 43 years, looked for a brief moment at the rose garden she had planted, then quietly drove into town. He expected to be home before lunch. Instead, before the morning was over, his own bank would freeze his account and remind him that the greatest risk to any institution isn't fraud. It's forgetting why it exists. The old brick building looked smaller than Thomas remembered, or perhaps he had simply become older. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching customers come and go, young parents carrying toddlers, an elderly couple walking hand in hand, a construction worker still wearing his reflective vest. Exactly the people he had hoped to serve 50 years earlier. He smiled. The sign above the entrance had changed. The logo had changed. Automatic doors had replaced the heavy oak door he used to unlock himself every morning. Progress. Helen would have liked that. She always believed businesses should change with the times, as long as they remembered who they served. Thomas picked up his briefcase and stepped inside. The branch buzzed quietly with activity, soft conversations, printers humming, telephones ringing. Everything looked clean, modern, professional. A young teller immediately looked up and smiled. "Good morning, sir." Thomas smiled back. "Good morning. How can we help you today?" "I only need to update my signature." "Certainly. My name is Ben. I will be happy to help you." Thomas nodded warmly. "It's nice to meet you, Ben." Ben led him to his desk. "Has your signature changed?" Thomas laughed softly. "My handwriting has become older." Ben smiled. "I know the feeling." Thomas looked at him with amused surprise. "You're a little young to know that feeling." Ben laughed. "My grandmother says I'm an old soul." Thomas smiled. "I think grandmothers are usually right." For several minutes, everything went smoothly. Ben scanned the new identification, compared the signatures. Then his screen flashed red. Ben frowned slightly. "One moment, please." Thomas waited patiently. Ben looked at the monitor again. The system required a manager's approval. I'm sorry, sir. I just need Miss Morgan to take a look. No problem. A few moments later, Rachel Morgan arrived. Professional, confident, calm. She greeted Thomas politely. Good morning. Good morning. Ben quietly explained the alert. Rachel compared the signatures herself, then checked the fraud prevention notice. She nodded slowly. I'm afraid our system requires additional verification. Thomas listened carefully. My account will be temporarily restricted until we complete the verification. Rachel nodded apologetically. I'm afraid that's correct. Thomas smiled gently. Good. Rachel blinked. I'm sorry. Thomas folded his hands. It means your security systems are working. Ben looked at him with surprise. Most customers reacted very differently. Rachel allowed herself a small smile. Thank you for understanding. Thomas nodded. If someone tried to access my account, I'd hope you would be just as careful. Rachel genuinely appreciated the compliment. She completed the paperwork. I'm afraid the verification team won't reopen the account until tomorrow morning. I understand. Thomas slowly stood, then asked politely, would it be all right if I waited here for a little while? Rachel glanced around the busy branch. Every seat in the waiting area was occupied. Customers continued arriving. I'm very sorry, but we really need the seating for clients currently being served. Thomas looked around, then smiled. Of course. He picked up his briefcase. Thank you for your help. Neither Rachel nor Ben noticed the tiny disappointment in his eyes. Not because his account had been frozen, but because, for the first time in 50 years, he was leaving his own bank without feeling just a little safer than when he had entered. Thomas stepped out of the branch. A cool drizzle had begun to fall, not enough to empty the streets, just enough to make everyone walk a little faster. He paused beneath the small awning outside the bank. The verification process would probably take only one day. It wasn't the delay that disappointed him. It was the feeling. He had walked into the bank, carrying complete confidence. He had walked out, feeling like a question mark. Thomas looked up at the gray sky and smiled faintly. Helen, I think you would have had something wise to say about this. She usually did. Inside the branch, Ben watched through the large front windows. He couldn't explain it. The elderly gentleman simply didn't look like someone who should be standing alone in the rain. Rachel walked past his desk. Everything all right? Ben hesitated. I was just thinking about the gentleman. Rachel glanced outside. He understood the situation. I know. He was very kind. Rachel smiled. I wish more customers reacted like that. So do I. She continued toward her office. Ben looked outside again. Thomas was still standing beneath the awning. Not upset, not impatient, simply standing there, as though he wasn't quite ready to leave. Ben quietly reached beneath his desk. His grandmother had insisted he keep a spare umbrella at work. You'll lend it to someone one day, she had said. He had laughed at the time. Now, without thinking, he picked it up. Rachel? She looked back. I'm just stepping outside for a minute. She nodded. Don't be long. Thomas had just started walking when he heard footsteps behind him. Sir? He turned. Ben stood there holding the umbrella. I thought. He suddenly looked a little embarrassed. You might like to borrow this. Thomas looked at the umbrella, then at the young teller. What about you? I'll survive. Thomas smiled warmly. I believe you will. He accepted it. Thank you. Ben shrugged. My grandmother would be upset with me if I didn't. Thomas laughed. I already like your grandmother. So do I. For a moment they simply stood beneath the umbrella together. Cars passed slowly through the rain. People hurried by carrying shopping bags. Finally Ben spoke. I'm sorry about your account. Thomas shook his head gently. Don't be. The bank did exactly what it was supposed to do. Ben frowned. It doesn't feel that way. Thomas looked at him curiously. No? Ben searched for the right words. It protected your money. He looked down for a moment. I'm just not sure it protected you. Thomas became very still. For a brief moment he simply looked at the young man. Then he smiled. What did you say your name was? Ben. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. Ben. I hope you never lose that way of thinking. Ben laughed nervously. My grandmother says I worry too much. Thomas smiled. No. I think she raised you exactly right. Across the street stood a small cafe. Thomas looked toward it. I was planning to have a cup of coffee before going home. Ben smiled. My break starts in 5 minutes. Thomas looked surprised. Does it? Ben nodded. If you don't mind some company. Thomas laughed softly. I'd enjoy that very much. 20 minutes later they sat together by the cafe window. Thomas stirred his coffee. You've been with the bank long? 6 months. And you enjoy it? I do. Ben smiled. I like helping people. My friends think I'm strange. Why? They say banking is about money. Thomas looked out through the rain-streaked window. What do you think? Ben didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, I think money is usually the smallest thing people bring into a bank. Thomas slowly looked back at him. What do you mean? Ben smiled thoughtfully. Sometimes they bring fear, sometimes hope, sometimes embarrassment, sometimes excitement. They're buying a first home. They've just lost someone. They're worried about paying bills. He shrugged. The money is easy. It's the people that are complicated. Thomas felt a quiet smile spread across his face. For several seconds he simply stirred his coffee. Finally he said, Ben, I've spent 50 years in banking. And I don't think anyone has explained it better. Ben laughed. I'll have to tell my grandmother. Thomas grinned. Please do. And tell her. She was right. You're an old soul. As they left the cafe, Thomas shook Ben's hand. Thank you. For the coffee? Thomas smiled. No, for reminding me why I opened a bank. Ben looked puzzled. He assumed the elderly gentleman simply meant banks in general. He had no idea how literally Thomas meant those words. The following morning, Rachel arrived at the regional leadership conference 30 minutes early. She liked arriving first. It gave her the time to organize her notes before the room filled with conversation. Her branch had once again achieved the highest compliance score in the region. Fraud prevention, identity verification, security audits. Every target had been exceeded. She quietly allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Her team had worked hard, very hard. Across the room, Ben was arranging coffee and notepads for the meeting. As the newest employee, he had volunteered to help before the presentations began. Rachel smiled. "Thank you, Ben." "My pleasure. You didn't have to come in early." Ben shrugged. "My grandmother says coffee tastes better if someone is already smiling when you arrive." Rachel laughed. "I'd like to meet your grandmother one day." So would half the customers. At precisely 9 o'clock, the CEO entered. Everyone took their seats. He smiled warmly. "Good morning. Before we begin today's agenda, I'd like to introduce someone. He doesn't attend many meetings anymore, but everything we do today began with him." The conference room doors opened. Thomas Whitmore quietly walked inside, carrying the same worn leather briefcase. Rachel froze, then almost dropped the coffee pot. Thomas smiled politely to everyone in the room. The CEO stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen, the founder of Community First Bank." The room erupted into applause. Thomas acknowledged it with a modest nod, then gently raised one hand. "Please. I've always preferred conversations to applause." The room laughed softly. Thomas waited until everyone had settled. Then he placed the old leather briefcase on the table. "I've been asked many times how we built this bank." People leaned forward. They usually expect me to talk about investments, interest rates, risk management. He smiled. "I'm going to disappoint you." Several managers chuckled. The truth is, Community First Bank wasn't built on money. He slowly opened the briefcase. Inside lay a single yellow sheet of paper. Time had turned its edges brown. He carefully held it up. "This is the first business plan I ever wrote." Several people smiled. "It contains exactly one sentence." He looked around the room, then read it aloud. "People should leave our bank feeling safer than when they entered." Silence settled over the room. Thomas folded the paper again. "My wife used to tease me," she said. "Thomas, that's a wonderful promise. Now you just have to remember it." The room laughed gently. Thomas smiled. "She spent 43 years reminding me." He walked toward the whiteboard, picked up a marker, slowly drew 2 large circles. One on the left, one on the right. The circles overlapped. Inside the first circle he wrote security. Inside the second, humanity. In the overlapping center, he carefully wrote one word. Trust. He put the marker down, then turned back toward the room. "If we lose security, people lose their money." He pointed to the first circle. "If we lose humanity, people lose something even more difficult to replace." He pointed to the second. "Their confidence." He tapped the overlapping center. "When both exist together, people trust us." No one spoke. Thomas looked around the room, then quietly asked, "Yesterday, who protected the bank?" Rachel answered almost automatically, "I did." Thomas smiled warmly. "You certainly did." She relaxed slightly. Then Thomas asked his second question, "And who protected the customer?" The room became perfectly still. Rachel looked down. For the first time since joining the bank, she didn't have an answer. Thomas didn't rescue her. He didn't embarrass her either. He simply waited. Finally, Rachel spoke. "I protected your account." She looked up. "But I forgot." to protect you as a person. Thomas smiled gently. Yes, that's exactly the difference. No accusation. No anger. Just understanding. Thomas nodded. And that's why I wanted us all to have this conversation. Because someday, every one of us, he looked around the room, will have to choose between following the procedure and fulfilling the purpose. The room remained silent, not because they had been corrected, because they had just understood the difference. The conference room remained unusually quiet. Thomas didn't seem eager to continue. He looked out of the large windows for a moment. People hurried along the sidewalks below. Some carried briefcases. Others pushed strollers. An elderly man slowly crossed the street with a walking stick. Finally, Thomas spoke again. You know, I've always found something rather interesting about banks. The others looked up. We spend millions protecting people's money. He smiled gently, and almost nothing teaching people how to protect their dignity. No one interrupted. Thomas wasn't criticizing. He was remembering. He turned back toward the room. When my father lost his savings, people often asked him how much money he had lost. Thomas paused. They never asked him how frightened he had become. He folded his hands. I learned something that year. Money can be replaced. Confidence takes much longer. He looked toward Rachel. Yesterday, you followed every policy. She nodded. I did. And I would never ask you not to. Rachel looked surprised. Thomas smiled. A bank without rules isn't a bank. Several managers nodded. But he let the words settle. A bank without compassion isn't much of a community either. Rachel slowly raised her hand. I'd like to ask you something. Please. When you asked if you could stay, what should I have done? Thomas smiled. I'm very glad you asked. He walked back to the whiteboard, then quietly erased one corner of the word humanity. Never remove security. He underlined it. Never. Then he looked at Rachel. But ask yourself one more question. He wrote beneath the circles. What does this person need right now? He stepped back. The answer won't always change your decision. Rachel listened carefully. Yesterday, the account still needed to remain frozen. She nodded. Yes. The ideas started to come from different sides now. Perhaps he could have waited in your office. Or been offered a chair. Or a cup of coffee. Thomas smiled. Or simply, someone sitting beside the customer for 5 minutes, explaining what would happen next. The room became very still. Thomas wasn't describing expensive solutions. He was describing kindness. Ben quietly looked down at his notebook. Without realizing it, he had written one sentence across the top of the page. People remember how we made them feel. Thomas noticed it. He smiled. May I borrow your notebook for a moment? Ben looked surprised. Of course. Thomas read the sentence aloud, then looked around the room. I couldn't have summarized today's meeting better myself. He handed the notebook back. May I suggest that we all write that sentence down, where we will see it every morning? Several managers nodded. One even took out a pen immediately. The CEO, who had remained silent throughout the discussion, finally spoke. I think we've all been expecting one question. Thomas looked at him. What question? The CEO smiled. What happens to Rachel? Several heads turned. Rachel remained seated. She had already accepted Whatever decision Thomas believed was right. Thomas looked at her for a long moment, then smiled. I have absolutely no intention of losing one of our best managers. Rachel blinked. You don't? No. You've built one of the safest branches in our company. He paused. Now, I'd like you to build one of the kindest. Rachel felt her eyes begin to fill, not because she had been forgiven, because she had been trusted. Thomas nodded gently. That is much harder. Rachel smiled through the first tear she had tried so hard to hide. I know. Thomas chuckled softly. No, I don't think you do yet. The room laughed. Even Rachel. Then Thomas added with a warm smile, but I have every confidence that you're about to find out. For the first time that morning, tension disappeared completely. Not because the meeting was over, because everyone understood they hadn't just attended a compliance review. They had been reminded why Community First Bank had been built in the first place. The following Monday morning, Community First Bank opened at exactly 9 o'clock. Nothing about the building had changed. The same glass doors, the same polished floors, the same orderly rows of desks. Customers entered carrying deposit slips, mortgage papers, and retirement forms. To anyone walking past, it looked like an ordinary day. But inside, something had quietly changed. Rachel unlocked her office, then paused. Instead of going inside, she walked back into the lobby. Ben looked up from his desk. Good morning. Rachel smiled. Good morning, Ben. He noticed something immediately. She wasn't carrying her tablet or her folder. She was carrying 2 cups of coffee. She placed one on his desk. I owe you one. Ben looked surprised. For what? She smiled. For reminding me that procedures don't make people feel welcome. Ben laughed. I thought Mr. Whitmore did remind us. Rachel shook her head. He reminded me. She smiled warmly. You showed me. Just then the entrance doors opened. An elderly woman stepped inside. She looked uncertain. She clutched a small envelope tightly in both hands. Ben immediately stood. Good morning. How can I help you? The woman looked embarrassed. I'm afraid I don't understand the letter your bank sent me. Ben smiled reassuringly. Let's look at it together. Rachel watched quietly. Normally, she would already have been back in her office. Instead, she remained exactly where she was. Watching. Learning. A few minutes later, another customer entered. A young father, carrying a sleepy little girl. He tried to complete paperwork, while holding her at the same time. Rachel walked over. She knelt beside the child. Would you like some paper? The little girl nodded shyly. Rachel brought a sheet of paper and a box of crayons from the children's corner. The father smiled with obvious relief. Thank you. Rachel smiled back. My pleasure. As she stood, she caught herself smiling. Not because she had solved a banking problem, because she had solved a human one. Just before lunch, the glass doors opened once more. Thomas Whitmore quietly stepped inside. No announcement, no greeting, simply another customer. Ben noticed him first. His face lit up. Good morning, Mr. Whitmore. Thomas smiled. Good morning, Ben. Did your account get sorted? Thomas laughed. It did. I'm officially myself again. Both men chuckled. Rachel walked over. Good morning, Mr. Whitmore. Thomas smiled. Good morning, Rachel. For a moment they simply looked at one another. Then Rachel spoke. I've been hoping you would come back. Thomas glanced around the lobby. I can see that. She looked slightly puzzled. You can? He nodded toward the elderly woman, who was now laughing with Ben. Then toward the little girl, proudly waiting to show Rachel a colorful drawing. Finally, he looked back at Rachel. You're seeing people. Rachel smiled softly. I'm trying. Thomas smiled. You're succeeding. Rachel hesitated. May I ask you one last question? Of course. She smiled. Do you still think this feels like your bank? Thomas looked around the lobby once more. The answer wasn't in the computers, or the security cameras, or the polished counters. It was in the conversations, the smiles, the patience, the feeling that no one was being hurried. He nodded slowly. Yes. Then, after a thoughtful pause, he added, But do you know something? Rachel shook her head. It never stopped. She looked surprised. Thomas smiled. The values were always here. They were simply waiting for someone to notice them again. Rachel looked toward Ben. He was helping another customer to fill out a form, talking quietly, listening carefully, exactly as he had done the week before. Thomas smiled. It usually starts with one person. As Thomas turned to leave, Ben called after him. Oh, I almost forgot. Thomas turned. My grandmother asked me to tell you something. Thomas laughed. I'm listening. Ben grinned. She says, You're an old soul too. For a moment, Thomas simply stood there. Then he laughed. A warm, genuine laugh that filled the entire lobby. Tell your grandmother, that's the nicest thing anyone has said to me in years. I will. Thomas stepped outside into the morning sunshine. He paused for a moment before walking to his car. Through the large windows he watched the life inside the branch. A young teller patiently explaining a form. A manager sitting beside a nervous customer, instead of across a desk. A little girl drawing pictures, while her father opened his first savings account. Nothing extraordinary. Just ordinary people, taking a little more time for one another. Thomas smiled. 50 years earlier, he had written one sentence on a yellow sheet of paper. People should leave our bank feeling safer than when they entered. Standing there on the sidewalk, he realized something. For the first time in many years, that promise wasn't hanging on a wall. It was quietly happening, one conversation at a time.